Bread was the center of life in the Middle Ages. For most people, it wasn't just part of the meal. It was the meal. Everything else, a bit of cheese, some onions, maybe a scrap of meat, was just something to eat with the bread. But when we picture medieval bread, we often think of one thing, maybe a round, crusty loaf of peasant bread. The truth is, there was no single type of medieval bread. The loaf on a peasant's table was completely different from the bread served in a king's hall. The difference came down to one main thing: the grain. The best and most expensive grain was wheat. Wheat flour could be sifted to make a fine white flour. This white flour produced the soft, light bread that the rich and powerful ate. It was a status symbol. To eat white bread meant you were wealthy. You didn't have to work in the fields. You could afford the best. This fine bread had special names like pain de mint or manchet. It was made from the whitest part of the wheat grain, with all the bran and germs sifted out. It was a pure luxury. It had little nutritional value compared to darker breads, but that wasn't the point. The point was its color and texture. It showed you were above the common folk. Most people could not afford white bread. They ate bread made from other grains. The most common grain for the working person, especially in Northern Europe, was rye. Rye is a tough grain. It can grow in poor soil and cold climates where wheat would fail. Its flour is dark and heavy. It makes a dense, dark bread with a strong, slightly sour flavor. This was the bread of the peasant. It was filling and nutritious. It stuck to your ribs and gave you the energy to work a long day in the fields. A peasant's loaf would be large, round, and dark brown or nearly black. It was the complete opposite of the Lord's white manchet. Then there was barley. Barley was even cheaper than rye. It was often seen as animal feed, but poor people ate it all the time. Barley bread was heavy, coarse, and had a slightly sweet, earthy taste. It didn't rise well, so the loaves were often flat and dense, more like a heavy cake. For many, barley bread was a sign of hard times. It was what you ate when you couldn't get rye or wheat. It filled the belly, but it wasn't something you enjoyed. Oats were another common grain, especially in colder, wetter places like Scotland or northern England. Oats were usually used for porridge or animal feed, but you could make bread from them. Like barley, oat flour doesn't rise much. Oat cakes, which are more like flat, hard crackers, were common. They were simple to make on a griddle over a fire. They were a food of last resort or for travelers, something durable that wouldn't spoil quickly. Often, these grains were not used alone. Bakers and housewives would mix them together. A common mix was wheat and rye. This was called maslin. The resulting bread was lighter than pure rye, but darker and cheaper than pure wheat. It was a compromise. A farmer might grow wheat and rye together in the same field. What he harvested, he milled and baked. This was a practical way to hedge his bets against bad weather that might ruin one crop but not the other. Maslin bread was the bread of the middle class, if such a thing existed. It was for skilled craftsmen, small landowners, and merchants. It was better than rye, but it wasn't the Lord's white bread. Sometimes, things got even tougher. During a famine or a bad harvest, people had to get creative. They would mix anything they could find into their flour to make it stretch. This was called dredge. They added ground peas, beans, lentils, or even acorns and chestnuts to their dough. This wasn't for flavor or nutrition. It was for survival. The bread would be dense, bitter, and barely edible. But it was food. It could keep, a family from starving. This famine bread tells a grim story. It shows how close to the edge of survival many people lived. The contents of your bread told everyone exactly who you were. It showed your wealth, your status, your region, and even how good the last harvest was. It was a social map, baked into a loaf. The journey of bread began long before the oven. It started in the field with the grain itself. Growing and harvesting grain was the most important work of the year. The entire community's survival depended on it. Men would cut the stalks of wheat or rye with a sickle, a curved blade that fit the hand. It was back-breaking work, done under the hot sun. The stalks were tied into bundles called sheaves and left in the field to dry. Once dry, the grain had to be separated from the stalk. This was called threshing. Peasants would lay the sheaves on a hard-packed dirt floor in a barn. Then they would beat the stalks with a tool called a flail. A flail was a long wooden handle with a shorter, heavier piece of wood attached by a leather strap. The thresher would swing the handle, causing the heavy end to crash down on the grain heads, knocking the seeds loose. It was rhythmic, exhausting work. Dust filled the air, getting into your eyes, nose, and lungs. After threshing, you had a pile of grain mixed with bits of stalk and husks, called chaff. The next step was to separate the good grain from this waste. This was done through winnowing. On a breezy day, a worker would use a shallow basket or a wooden shovel to toss the mixture into the air. The wind would catch the lighter chaff and blow it away, while the heavier grains fell back to the ground onto a clean sheet. This was repeated over and over until only the clean grain was left. Now the grain was ready to be turned into flour. For this, you needed a mill. In the early Middle Ages, many families had their own small, hand-operated mill called a cornstone. A quern was two round, flat stones, one on top of the other. The top stone had a handle. You would pour grain into a hole in the center, and as you turned the top stone, the grain was crushed into a coarse flour between the two stones. It was slow, hard work, usually done by women. It could take hours to grind enough flour for a single day's bread. But as time went on, lords and monasteries built bigger, more efficient mills powered by water or wind. And they made it a rule that everyone living on their land had to use the lord's mill. You were not allowed to use your own cornstone. This was called a soak. The lord's mill was a source of power and money. The miller, who ran the mill for the lord, would take a portion of everyone's flour as payment. This was called the multure. It was often a significant amount, maybe 1/16 or more of the flour. People hated this system. The miller was one of the most distrusted figures in a medieval village. There were endless stories and songs about cheating millers. People believed they kept the best flour for themselves, or that their measuring scoops had false bottoms. They said the miller's thumb was golden because he would press his thumb on the scale to make the flour seem heavier, cheating people out of their share. But there was little anyone could do. The lord owned the mill, and you had to use it. To be caught using a cornstone could result in a fine or having your corn confiscated and broken. The millstones themselves had a huge impact on the flour. They were massive, heavy stones grooved to help grind the grain. As they ground together, tiny bits of stone would chip off and get mixed into the flour. This meant that most medieval bread had grit in it. This grit was a constant feature of the diet, and it wore down people's teeth over their lifetime. Skeletons from the period often show teeth that are worn flat from years of chewing gritty bread. Once ground, the flour wasn't uniform. It was a whole grain flour, full of bran and germ. For the finest white bread, this flour had to be sifted, or bolted. This was done by shaking the flour through cloths of different weaves. The coarsest cloth would let everything through. A finer cloth would hold back the largest pieces of bran. The very finest cloth, sometimes made of silk, would only let the purest, whitest flour pass through. This process was expensive and time-consuming. It created different grades of flour. The fine white flour went to the lord. The next grade, with some bran, went to the baker for maslin bread. The leftover bran and coarse flour, called bran flour or horse bread, was often used to bake crude loaves for servants or animals. So even the flour itself was divided by class, sorted and separated long before it ever became dough. Flour was the heart of bread, but it wasn't the only ingredient. What else went into the dough determined its texture, its flavor, and how long it would last. The other three key components were water, salt, and whatever made the bread rise. Each of these was more complicated than it sounds. Water was the most basic ingredient, but its quality mattered. The water came from the village well, a nearby river, or a stream. It wasn't the clean, treated water we have today. It could have silt, bacteria, or other impurities. The minerals in the water also affected the dough. The hard water, which is rich in minerals, could make the dough stronger and easier to handle. Soft water could make it sticky and weak. A baker had to know their water source and how to work with it. They didn't understand the chemistry, of course, but through experience they knew how the water from the well behaved compared to water from the river. Salt was far more important and valuable than we can imagine today. We just buy it cheaply at the store. In the Middle Ages, salt was a precious commodity. It was difficult to produce. It either had to be mined from the earth in a process that was dangerous and labor-intensive, or it had to be evaporated from seawater, which was a slow process that depended on the weather. Because it was so hard to get, salt was expensive and heavily taxed. It was a source of wealth for kings and merchants. For a baker, salt was essential. It wasn't just for flavor. Salt controls the fermentation of the dough, slowing down the yeast so the bread doesn't rise too quickly and then collapse. It also strengthens the gluten in the flour, which gives the bread a better structure and texture. And most importantly, salt acted as a preservative. A salted loaf would resist mold and stay edible for longer. This was crucial in a time without refrigeration. A peasant family might only bake once a week, so their bread had to last. But because salt was expensive, the amount used in a loaf often depended on your wealth. The bread of the poor might have very little salt, making it bland and quick to spoil. The bread of the rich would be properly salted, enhancing its flavor and keeping it fresh. The final key ingredient was the leavening agent, the thing that makes bread rise and become light and airy. Today we use commercial yeast. Medieval bakers didn't have that. They relied on natural methods. The oldest method was to simply let the dough sit out. Wild yeasts are present in the air and on the grains of flour all the time. If you mix flour and water and leave it, these wild yeasts will start to feed on the sugars in the flour. As they feed, they produce carbon dioxide gas. This gas gets trapped in the dough, forming bubbles and making it expand. This is what we now call a sourdough starter. A medieval baker or housewife would keep a piece of dough from each batch to start the next one. This piece of dough, called the leaven, was full of active wild yeasts. When mixed into a new batch of flour and water, the yeast would multiply and make the new dough rise. Each region, and even each family, would have its own unique culture of wild yeasts, giving their bread a distinct, slightly sour flavor. This is why rye bread, which was almost always made this way, has that characteristic tangy taste. But there was another very common source of leavening. It came from the other great medieval industry, brewing beer. When you brew beer, the yeast used for fermentation produces a thick, foamy scum on top of the liquid. This foam, called barm, is full of living yeast. Brewers would collect this barm and sell it to bakers. It was a much faster, more reliable leavening agent than a sourdough starter. Her barm produced a lighter, less sour bread. It was especially good for wheat breads. The connection between brewing and baking was very strong. The two businesses were often located right next to each other. The baker got his yeast from the brewer, and the brewer might even use the baker's oven to dry malted grain. This barm was the closest thing they had to modern yeast, and it was a key ingredient in the breads made for townsfolk and the wealthy. Of course, not all bread was leavened. Some of the earliest and simplest breads were unleavened flatbreads. These were just flour and water, maybe a little salt mixed into a stiff dough and cooked quickly on a hot surface. Oat cakes were a form of this, so were simple griddle cakes baked over an open fire. These breads were fast and easy. You didn't need to wait for them to rise. They were the food of travelers, soldiers, and people in a hurry. They were a reminder that, at its most basic, bread required little more than flour, water, and heat. Once the dough was mixed and kneaded, it had to be baked. How and where this happened depended a lot on where you lived and how much money you had. The image of every medieval cottage having its own oven is not accurate. Ovens were expensive and dangerous. Building one took a lot of stone or clay, and the fire needed to heat it was a constant risk in a village of wood and thatch houses. So, most people did not have their own oven. In a typical village, there was a communal oven. This oven usually belonged to the lord of the manor, just like the mill, and just like the mill, you were often required to use it and pay a fee. The fee could be a small amount of money, or, more likely, a loaf of bread from your batch. On baking day, families would prepare their dough at home, shaping it into loaves. They would put a unique mark or symbol on their loaf so they could identify it later. Then, they would carry their unbaked loaves to the communal bakehouse. The oven itself was a large dome made of brick or stone, and a fire would be built directly inside the oven and left to burn for hours until the walls were intensely hot. Then, the baker would rake out all the embers and ashes and quickly mop the oven floor. The heat was now stored in the thick walls. The villagers would hand over their loaves, and the baker would use a long wooden paddle called a peel to slide them into the hot oven. The door, often just a stone or a metal sheet, was sealed shut. The bread baked in the residual heat of the oven walls. If the oven was hottest at the beginning, the loaves that needed the most heat, like large wheat loaves, went in first. As the oven slowly cooled, other things might be baked, like smaller rye loaves, then pies or cakes, and finally, the last of the heat might be used to dry fruits or grain. This system had its pros and cons. It was a social event. Neighbors would gather and talk while waiting for their bread. It was also safer than having dozens of small fires in individual homes, but it also meant you had to bake on the Lord's schedule. And you had to trust the baker not to steal your dough or swap your big loaf for a smaller one. Like the miller, the village baker often had a reputation for being a bit of a cheat. In cities and large towns, baking was a professional trade. Bakers had their own shops with large ovens. They were part of a powerful guild, which set standards for training, quality, and prices. The price and weight of bread were often strictly regulated by law. The most famous of these laws in England was the assize of bread and ale. This law linked the legal weight of a loaf of bread to the price of grain. If grain was cheap, a penny would buy you a large loaf. If grain was expensive, the penny loaf would be much smaller. Bakers who cheated their customers by selling underweight loaves faced harsh penalties. They could be fined or publicly shamed. A common punishment was to be dragged through the streets on a wooden sled with the bad loaf of bread tied around your neck. To avoid this, bakers often added an extra small roll to a dozen loaves to make sure the total weight was correct. This is the origin of the term a baker's dozen, which means 13 instead of 12. But what if you were poor, or lived far from a village, or just didn't want to pay the Lord's fee? You could still bake bread without an oven. The most common way was to bake on the hearth, the open fire in the center of a one-room cottage. You could make a simple flatbread on a griddle, a flat piece of stone or metal placed over the embers. Or you could use a pot or a bake stone. A common method was to put the dough in a cast iron pot with a lid, place it on the embers, and then pile more hot embers on top of the lid. This created a small, temporary oven, baking the bread from all sides. Another way was to place the dough directly on a clean hot stone from the hearth and cover it with a large clay pot. Then you would pile the embers around the pot. These methods produced a denser, crustier bread than an oven, often with a smoky flavor from the fire. It wasn't perfect, but it was bread. And for millions of people, this was how their daily loaf was made. The finished loaf of bread was much more than just food. It was a direct reflection of your place in the world. The type of bread you ate, its color, its density, and even how you ate it sent a clear message about your social status. Society was a strict hierarchy, and bread was one of the most visible ways that hierarchy was expressed every single day. At the very top of the social ladder was the king, the nobles, and high-ranking clergy. They ate the finest bread, the pain de mie or manchette. This was the bread made from pure, finely sifted white wheat flour. It was light, soft, and delicate. It was a symbol of their purity and their separation from the manual labor that defined the lives of the common people. To them, the dark, heavy bread of the peasants was coarse and animal-like. Their white bread was a sign of their refined taste and their God-given right to rule. It was served fresh at every meal, often cut into thick slices. Below the great lords were the lesser gentry, merchants, and skilled artisans. They ate a bread that was a step down, but still respectable. This was often the Maslin bread, made from a mix of wheat and rye. It was not as white as the Lord's manchette, but it was far better than the pure rye loaf of a farmhand. This bread, sometimes called torte, was a sign of a comfortable life. It said you were successful enough to afford some wheat, but still practical and not putting on the airs of the nobility. This was the bread of the growing towns and cities, the food of a rising middle class. Then came the vast majority of the population, the peasants, serfs, and laborers. Their daily bread was the dark, heavy loaf made from rye or barley. It was dense, chewy, and filling. It had to be. This loaf was the bulk of their calories. It gave them the physical strength for hard labor. It was often baked only once a week and would get progressively harder and staler as the days went on. A stale crust of rye bread was a common breakfast, perhaps softened by dipping it in ale or water. This bread wasn't a luxury, it was fuel. Its dark color and coarse texture were a constant reminder of a life tied to the soil. There were even breads below this. For the truly destitute, or for everyone during times of famine, there was bread made with peas, beans, or acorns. This was the bread of desperation. And there was also horse bread, a very coarse loaf made from bran and the worst quality flour, baked specifically for animals. In very hard times, even the poorest people might be forced to eat horse bread to survive. How bread was used at the table also showed status. In a wealthy household, stale bread found a second life as a trencher. Before plates were common, a thick slice of stale, flat bread, about 4 days old, was used as a plate. You would place your meat and other food on top of the trencher. The juices and gravies would soak into the bread. At the end of the meal, a person of high status might eat their sauce-soaked trencher. Or, in a gesture of charity, they would give it to the poor who waited at the gates, or to their dogs. This act reinforced the social order. The bread that served as a plate for the rich became a meal for the poor. Bread also had a deep religious meaning. In the Christian church, bread was central to the most important ritual, the Eucharist. It represented the body of Christ. This gave bread a sacred quality. Wasting bread was considered a sin. A cross was often cut into the top of a loaf before baking, both to help it rise evenly and as a blessing. Bread was a symbol of life, community, and divinity. Sharing bread with someone was a fundamental sign of hospitality and trust. From the finest white manchette on a king's silver platter to the gritty barley cake baked in the ashes of a peasant's fire, medieval bread was never just one thing. It was a spectrum. Every loaf told a story of the person who ate it. It spoke of their wealth, their work, their health, and their hopes. It was the food that fueled a civilization, but it was also the symbol that held it together, defining the place of every single person within it.